So my name's Kerry Nicholson. I'm an archivist at Lancashire Archives, and today I'm going to be giving a talk about different sources you can use to research pubs, the history of the building itself, and the publicans and licensees who've actually run the pubs. Should start really. I love this image. I found this image on Red Rose Collections. So this is one of a number of photographs that are stored within library collections. And when I first started thinking about doing this talk, it was about 18 months ago when we were coming up with our programme for last year. And obviously I had no idea what was going to happen in terms of the pandemic and the fact that all of our pubs were going to be closed. And obviously that's potentially going to have a huge impact on the industry and really put a lot more pubs at risk. So it's made images like this feel even more nostalgic than it was when I found it. But this is obviously taken from one of the guild years in Preston. I think it was 1972, which is why the decorations are up. But obviously just in terms of two people gathering outside a pub to have a drink, it just feels so much more nostalgic now than it did even a year ago. Things have just changed so much in our lives in this time. Before I go on to the records themselves, I just want to have a quick talk about definitions and some of the languages that you hear used in terms of pubs. Traditionally, ale and beer have always been a big part of the British diet, and that's just because in the medieval period and even long after that, untreated water and the water that most people had access to for drinking just wasn't particularly safe to drink. And actually the brewing process that was used to produce ales and beers made them much safer to drink than the untreated water. So brewing and beer houses have always been a big part of British life. They've been around for centuries. Ale was traditionally made without hops, but then in the 14th and 15th century, ale began to be brewed with hops, and that was originally what was known as beer. But by 1550, most brewing involved hops, and ale houses and beer houses pretty much became the same thing, ale and beer. Ale houses and beer houses could only sell ale or beer. They were generally domestic properties. It was people brewing in their own homes and then selling those goods to people to be drunk in their homes. The next step up is a tavern, and they kind of developed out of ancient Roman tabernae, and they could also sell wines and spirits. A lot of those taverns eventually developed into coffee houses. They were generally much bigger and generally seen as having a higher class clientele. They were a social space for the wealthier classes to gather in, unlike the beer houses that might have a more working class client base. And then the next step up again were inns, and they were generally bigger again, much more comfortable premises. They might offer accommodation, and they really grew important in the age of the stagecoach. So you get big coaching inns, and then also railway hotels when the railway lines developed. From the 18th century, any property which sold alcohol on site really came to be known as a public house, which was then shortened to a pub. There's also a distinction in licensing between on licenses and off licenses. So I think we're all familiar with the off license term as somewhere that sells alcohol to be consumed off the premises. But you also have pubs and licensed premises described as on licensed premises, and that's where the drink is sold to be drunk actually on the premises. You also have the term sign used in a lot of licensing records, and that's generally the name of the pub. But it goes back to an era when most of the population would have been illiterate, and any kind of shop selling goods would have a sign outside to indicate what kind of goods were being sold. But later on, the sign came to reflect the actual name of the pub. And it's worth looking at the names of pubs as well, because they can give you clues about when the pub might have opened. Obviously, lots of pubs with Victoria in their name probably date back to the era of Queen Victoria's reign. For me, just things I didn't even pick up in terms of my local pubs in Kirkham where I grew up. One of them is called the Derby Arms, one of them is the Stanley. And really, until researching this, it didn't even cross my mind that there might be a link to the Earls of Derby and the Stanley family. So you do pick up these things, these connections to the local landowners and who might have owned that pub and that land when it was developed. Now, before I talk about the records that we actually hold, I want to quickly run through some of the licensing laws. Now, licensing laws stretch back to the medieval period, but really the laws that actually created records that are the ones that we're interested in, because they've created these sources that we can now use, really date to the mid-16th century. Most of this summary information I'm going to give actually comes from the London Metropolitan Archives. They've got a really good guide on the website to licensed victualers' records, and I pulled a lot of this information from that. So as we said, pubs have been part of English life since Roman times, but really until the mid-16th century, when the first national system of licensing was introduced, there aren't a lot of records of them. So the first big act for us was the Alehouses Act of 1552. And under that act, no one could sell ale or beer without the consent of a local justice of the peace. So each person that was registered had to enter into a recognizance, which is a kind of legal obligation where they agree that they will have good behaviour in their pub, no misbehaviour, they'll abide by the court's terms, and if they don't, they might have to pay a fine or potentially even lose the licence. They also had to have two sureties who would guarantee that behaviour, or they themselves could also risk losing a fine. From 1729, licences were granted annually at a special licensing session, and this was known as a Brewster session. Under the Licensing Act of 1753, new licences could only be granted by people who had produced a certificate of good character, which usually had to be signed by notable people, vicars, other important people within the parish. This act also introduced the keeping of full registers of victualers by the Clerk of the Peace. The Alehouses Act of 1828 and the Beer Act of 1830 disbanded most of these previous licensing controls. At this point, any householder could sell beer, ale or cider without a licence by paying 2 guineas to excise officers, as long as they were selling it from their own property. There was no legal obligation for the Clerk of the Peace to keep records, so there's a big gap in records in this period, really from 1828 to the 1870s when the next laws come in. There is a big gap in the official licensing records. In 1859, there was a new Wine and Beer House Act, and that reintroduced stricter controls, much more like the controls before. Retailers selling beer and wine had to obtain the licenses from justices. And then the Intoxicating Liquor Act in 1872 obliged the Clerks of the Peace to keep a register of all licenses granted. These decisions were usually made at local petty sessions or police courts, and that's usually where you'll find these later registers now in our collections. A county licensing committee had to be set up by the quarter sessions to confirm the granting of all new licenses. And then there were further licensing acts in 1902 and 1904, which obliged all applicants for new licenses to submit plans of their properties. There obviously were further licensing changes after that, but very few of them had an impact on the records that were being kept, really until 2005, when licensing became the responsibility of local councils rather than the court system. So at some point in the future, we will find that our licensing records that come in are coming via the council collections, but that hasn't really happened yet. Really, for now, the main focus is going to be court records. Now, when you start talking about licensing, it's kind of similar to marriage licenses as well in a way. You might expect to find the actual licenses for the pubs, but actually what we have are the administration of those licenses. We have records of the licenses being issued to, but not of the licenses that were actually given to the Publicans. But this was just one rare example for one particular pub that I found in one of our estate collections. And wanted to point out because it's quite a nice early example. So we've got a bundle of licenses which date from 1719 to 1737. for the Swan Inn at Clitheroe. They're pretty much annual licenses, and they show the name of the person who's been licensed to sell alcohol from the pub. Both of these examples, which are from 1719 on the left and 1723 on the right, show that the licensee was Daniel Leacock. These, as I said, are within an estate collection, so it may be that the pub was actually owned by a landholder of the estate, who was the first Earl Brownlow. And the bundle also has some repairs for the pub, which took place in 1748. So this is quite a rare example of early records for an individual pub within our collection. But actually, the main collection of alehouse records that we first point most people towards are the alehouse recognizances, and those are within QSB 3. The records start in 1619 and they end in 1829 when those new licensing laws were brought in. They are arranged by hundred, and sometimes you may not be, if you're not sure about which hundred a particular township belongs to, the way to find that, we've got a gazetteer in our search room in the archive, which is in grey binders at the reception desk, where you can look up an individual town and actually find out which hundred it belongs to in terms of these alehouse licenses. As I say, they're usually annual lists. We don't necessarily have surviving lists for every single year, but we do have pretty good coverage. And obviously, the earlier they get, the more difficult they are to read and to use. And they come in different formats. Now, we've got thousands of these documents, so I just looked at a few samples over different periods of time to see how the formats changed and how the records were kept. So the image on the left is one of the earliest ones that we've got covering Amounderness, and it dates from 1647. Here the names are grouped into threes, so we can probably be fairly sure that for each grouping, the first name might be the licensee, and the next two names given are potentially the sureties. But you can see in the later one, which is 1741, it's a lot less clear how the information has been recorded and organised. Some individuals are listed as paying for someone. So, for example, there's Robert Bell for John Fisher of Bispham. Some of them are named in their own right, and the sureties are clearly listed underneath them. One example here is Christopher Brandwood of Goosner, who is listed above William Hyam, his surety. But as you can see, looking at these, or maybe not, in neither example is the pub given. So you've got the township, and you've got the name of a particular licensee, potentially operating a pub within that town. But from these records, there's no way of knowing what pub they were actually running, what the name of the pub would have been. By 1828, when this example is taken from, things were a lot clearer. So this is one of a bundle of forms, and each pub relates to each form relates to the license for an individual pub. So in this example, we found out that there's been a licensing session at the Black Horse in John Ball, at the sign of the Red Lion at Garstang, is shown as owing the king £30, and Robert Gardner of the same township, who's an innkeeper, owes £20. Now, the lesser amount for him probably suggests that it's John Ball who is the licensee, and Gardner is acting as a surety. The document goes on to describe in detail the agreement that both men are bound to, and it lists all sorts of rules that they have to follow, including not diluting the drinks, selling full measures, not allowing drunkenness or gambling in the pub, able to open during divine service on a Sunday, early in the morning or late at night, and to make sure that they maintain good order in the pub. And this license is valid for a year, and they'd have to come back every year to renew it. Now, we heard at the start that the Clerk of the Peace was meant to keep registered house recognizances from 1753, but actually only a small number of them have survived in our collections, which is a shame because they're actually much easier to use than the alehouse licenses themselves, the recognizances. So we've got registers for 1822 up to 1829. Again, they're arranged by hundred, but some of the larger hundreds have actually been divided down into licensing divisions. There's no obvious order within the sections themselves to the information. Pubs from different townships are listed alongside each other. but the registers give the names of the principal, who is probably the licensee, the name of the pub and the where it's found, the names of the sureties, names of the justices, and the last column hasn't been filled in this example, but that in some pages has details of convictions for breaking the licensing laws. Now, some of the other sessions collections have references to pubs as well, outside of the main licensing series. So QSB 1, the recognizance rolls, and QSP, quarter sessions petitions, do have lots of references scattered throughout them. And some of these have been in our catalogue. All of the QSPs are indexed, and quite a few of the QSBs are indexed thanks to a volunteer project. So you can try just keyword searches in the catalogue. Try looking for words like alehouse, victular, disorderly house, a personal name if you're looking for someone who was a licensee in this period, or sometimes the name of the pub will turn things up as well. So for one example, I found within QSBs for 1828, there's a certificate that John Collier of Cheapside, Preston, known by the sign of the Black Bull, is of good character for an alehouse licence. So we know that in 1828, John Collier was the one who was running the Black Bull pub in Preston. This example is one of 3 witness statements relating to a tavern brawl that's taken place in Ormskirk in 1639. There's a number of people involved. There's John Ledbetter and Thomas Whitestones, who were drinking in the dwelling house of Edward Harper, an alehouse keeper. So this is one of these examples. It's just a little house in Ormskirk where Edward Harper is presumably brewing his own beer and selling it to people who come in off the street for a drink. Thomas Whitestones in his statement says that John Ledbetter called him a John Ledbetter claims that Thomas Whitestones accused him of stealing a hat. Foul words passed between them, and White hit Ledbetter. Ledbetter decided to leave the pub and get out of the way, away from the trouble, but he was followed by Whitestones, who then stabbed him. And then the watch come along and called the surgeon, and the last witness statement is from the surgeon, who talks about Ledbetter's wound, says it was 3 inches deep, and if it had been an inch or so to the other side, he might have been killed. It could have been fatal. There's one last set of records that I want to mention in the actual quarter sessions collection, and that is QAD, which are the records of the licensing committee. Now, QAD 1 to 4 are the actual licensing committee minutes, and again, they're split into hundreds. So there's a series for London hundreds, there's one for Mountain Blackburn and Leyland hundreds, there's one for West Derby hundreds, and there's one for Salford hundreds. And they start in 1873 and run right up to 1974. Now, I did have a quick look through some of the minute books. They do vary enormously. A lot of the information is actually about the organisation of the committee. So appointing officers, financing the committee, but there's less about the individual pubs and licensing decisions. Where pubs are mentioned, it's generally in terms of compensation, where the renewal of a licence has been turned down. And there's a whole separate series of records relating to these decisions. So QAD 6 is a series of licensing reports which relates to the decisions about compensation. They survived from 1907 to 1939 and then 1947 to 1948. There's only a few boxes of these, so they only cover a small number of pubs, but where they do cover a pub of interest, they have lots and lots of information. Now, unfortunately, they're not actually indexed in terms of the name of the pub, so it would just be a case of trawling through them to see if you find something of interest. But as I say, they've got a lot of information in them. So the Balfour Act was brought in 1904, and that meant that prior to that act, an application for a licence could only really be turned down if there was evidence of misconduct or misbehaviour from the licensee. But after this act, the licensing committee could decide to turn down an application if they thought that it was surplus to requirements. If they thought there were already enough pubs in the area and there was no need for this one to remain open, they could turn down the licence. There was a big drive from the government at this time to actually close a lot of pubs and reduce the number of licensed premises. And a lot of people who were serving on licensing committees were actually involved in the temperance movement, which was why there was this move to close the properties. But also there was a big outcry from the licensees themselves and from the brewing industry, which is why this system of compensation came in. So there was a levy on all licensed premises which funded the compensation. And the owners and the licensee would have to be paid a sum, which was calculated from the difference between the value of the premises, either with or without a license. So you get quite an assessment of the business at the pub and the considered value of the property. So this example is from 1935, and it relates to the Railway Tavern in Lee. And that's a beer house, which is owned by George Shaw & Co., but managed by Emma Jackson, who's been the tenant since 1925. The rateable value is given and the premises are described. The business premises include a vault, a smoke room, parlour, a tap room, and a cellar. And the private accommodation includes a kitchen, a scullery, a larder, and 4 bedrooms. There have been 2 previous convictions against the property, but they were back in 1869 and 1872. So it seems like she's been running it reasonably well over these recent years. The trade figures are given, which includes numbers of barrels of beer, dozens of bottled beer, and stout. In this case, the licence renewal has been opposed by the Chief of Police in Lee, and the general comments at the bottom state that the house would appear to have been made out of 2 cottages. There is not a real comfortable room in the whole of the premises. The bar is at the extreme end from the living room, rendering supervision over the customers by the licensee very difficult. It's fairly clean in a rough way, but needs decorating. It's entirely out of date for the purposes of a licensed house. The tenant's living accommodation is very bad. It's such that if it were a cottage, it would be cleared under the slum clearance scheme. In view of the number of licensed houses in the vicinity, this house could be dispensed with without any inconvenience to the public. And all the handwritten notes on the side are calculating how much compensation should be paid out as part of the pub closing, which in this case is, I think, £125 to Emma Jackson, who's been running the pub, and over a couple of £1,000, I think, to the owners of the pub. The other series of records within QED are returns of public houses. We only have these for a couple of years, but again, they're a really good snapshot of the viewing of the licensing industry in those years. So QED 5.1 dates from 1890. It's a small volume. At the front of it, the statistics that have been asked to be gathered by the Chief Constable. There's a place index, and that gives a summary of the number of public houses and beer houses in each district, and the proportion of public houses to the population of each district. So you can get a sense of the size of the population and how many pubs were in each town in terms of the population density. So we can see here that Kirkham has 1 pub for every 508 people. Lancaster has 1 pub for every 895. And Manchester has 1 pub for every 1,621 people. The actual licensing division pages for each licensing area give the name and location of each pub, a description of the accommodation and stabling, and the distance to nearby pubs. So this page shows Lancaster licensing division. One example on here is the Boot and Shoe pub at Scotfirth, which is 1 bed, travellers, space to feed 1 visitor, and stabling for 2 horses, and it's 1 mile from the 2 nearest pubs. The next return was taken in 1904, and there's 4 bundles, QAD 5.2 to 5, and they were arranged by 100 and licensing division, and then by township. But the actual townships aren't arranged alphabetically within the bundles, so they can take a bit of digging through them to actually find a particular area that you are interested in. These forms give the name of the pub, the name and address of the owner, the name of the licensee, whether the pub was free or whether it was tied to a particular brewery and could only sell their alcohol, and the annual value of the property. So this example is for the pubs in Broughton and Amounderness. We've got the Black Bull, which is licensed to Robert Cookson, and the Golden Ball, which is licensed to James Bell. From the late 19th century, we saw that responsibility for licensing came back to the justices in the early 1870s. and it moved from the higher Quarter Sessions Court down to the petty sessions of the police courts. And the records generally begin in 1872. For most of the petty sessions courts, we've got a pretty good run of licensing registers. But you do have to take care in terms of that word. Most of the catalogues don't give any description of what you might find within the licensing register. And I did find some different examples of format. Most of them, though, are like this example here. So this one was actually taken from a Blackburn Borough Police collection, but it's got a pretty standard format, and generally they're arranged by pub name, but some of them do actually have a name index of licensees in the front, which is really useful where it does exist. And it gives the name of the pub, the name of the license holder, the date of any changes of license, the name and address of the owner, and details of convictions for breaking licensing laws. There's quite a few convictions on this example, and they are generally for permitting drunkenness within the pub or for selling beer outside permitted licensing hours. So most of the licensing registers we have seem to be that I looked at were in this kind of format. But this one here is a later example from the Preston Petty Sessions Court. This dates from 1971, and it's much more like a traditional court register. So the information is just listed in date order for court appearances, and it doesn't seem to be general licensing of pubs. It's actually much more to do with specific applications for special exemptions to licensing laws, maybe for late night opening for special events. So this is a slightly different kind of licensing register that we do have in some of our collections. One last thing within the petty sessions records. We heard at the start that from the 1900s, pubs had to submit plans of the properties if they were applying for a new license. We don't have them for all of our licensing divisions, unfortunately, but we've got good collections for a number of them, including Bolton, Burnley, Darwin, Garstang, Kirkdale, Preston, and Rossendale. So this is just one example I found. This is just a small section of the plan for the Old Black Bull in Preston. I think it's got a really good overview of the actual layout of the pub at the time. I think this was about 1901, 1900 it says there. You can see at the front of the building, we've got the bar, the parlour, and the music room. And at the back of the building, there's the brew house, and then lots and lots of space for stabling for people travelling through Preston who want to stable up their horses. So they're the main records that you tend to find within petty sessions courts. There are other odds and ends, generally just within individual courts. So this is just a bit hit and miss depending on what particular area it is that you're researching. But these are just some examples that I found. So PSDA 51 is Darwin Licensing Committee minutes. They survived from 1881 through to 1947. You can see from this page, we've got licenses for individual named pubs being transferred between different people. Again, PSRD 14 is from Rossendale, and there's a whole series of reports of inspections of licensed premises. There's information gathered in 20 different categories, which includes the nature of the license, the extent of the accommodation, again, the distance from the two nearest pubs. The example I scanned actually isn't for a pub, it's for an off license. It was just a random one I picked. And it was found within Bacup Market. And the form shows us that James Maudsley has been the licensee for the last 22 years. So if you are researching a pub in the Rossendale area in this sort of era, this is a really helpful thing that could just save you trawling through lots of licensing records, because it gives you that quick summary of how long they've been running the licensed premises. This example is from St Helens, and it's actually a list of licensed victuallers within the borough. We've got one list from 1882 to 1892, and another one for 1897 to 1901. As you can see here, it gives the name and address of each licensee, the name of their pub, and the name and address of the pub owner. This page shows licensed victuallers within Windle. So it's quite a good summary of what the pubs were in the area at the time, who was running them. And you can see here, the vast majority are actually owned by Greenall & Co., who were a brewery that was founded in St Helens in 1762. The brewery records are really possibly the next step you might want to take in terms of researching a particular pub. The National Archives Catalogue Discovery is probably the best place to find out where they might be held. Some are deposited with county archives. Some of them are still held privately, so some big licensing companies do have their own archivists. So it will vary enormously. So it's always worth having a look at Discovery to try and find out where those records are stored. But there was a big growth in the Industrial Revolution in regional brewers like this, and they started to buy up pubs and tie them so that they could only sell their beer. The main collection we've got is for Dutton's of Blackburn, and that came to us from the Whitbread Group when they actually closed their archive, and they split them up to the most appropriate places to store them. It's actually quite a big collection. It's got lots of different records in it, everything from minutes and wages books to share registers, photographs and plans to advertising material, and even examples of beer bottle labels, which is what these were. But in terms of actually researching individual pubs, probably the most useful are the Public House Trade Books, which are referenced DDX 2310/1/11. These run little sort of lever arch, little mini lever arch files. There's quite a number of them. This is just one example I pulled up, which was for the Derby Arms pub at Trails. So the first page gives us the type of license and the name of the licensee, who in this case was Edward Dawson. The second page gives the volume of alcohol that was being supplied, includes barrels, presumably of beer, dozens of pints and gallons of wines and spirits. And you can start to get a sense of what the local trade might have been like. Here, they're drinking a lot more beer than they are wines and spirits, and the sales seem to peak particularly in the summer, which probably makes sense for kind of a country pub out at Trails like this. You would expect that to be their busiest period, really. Now, obviously, pubs themselves are being run as businesses, but it seems to be quite unusual for the records of the pubs themselves to be deposited. Obviously, they're part of a bigger business in terms of the brewery. Don't really have a lot of examples of business records of individual pubs. So you need to start to look much more broadly at more general records that might record businesses. So one of them, as a good starting point, is trade directories. Licensed premises can come under lots of different headings over the years, so it can be worth looking under in the classified section under beer houses, under hotels, taverns and inns, or under public houses. Now, for most towns, the earliest example is probably going to be Baines, Lancashire, which dates from 1824. Other examples, generally, you look at the 1850s or the 1950s. This example is from a Lancaster Trade Directory, 1912 to 13. There's two separate sets of listings, one under beer houses, which are probably the much smaller operations just being run from private residences, and one under hotels and inns, which are probably much bigger operations. When you have a look here, it flags up a problem that you probably need to be aware of when researching pubs. Even on this one example, there are 2 pubs called the Black Horse and 3 called the Blue Anchor. So you do need to take care when you come across the name of a pub to try to ascertain that it is actually the one that you're researching. These are fairly typical of trade directories. The Barrett's Directories of Preston from the early 1800s give very similar information to these examples. But when I looked at 1960s Kelly's Directory of Manchester, it just gave the name and address of the pub and doesn't actually give the name of the licensee. So information obviously will vary over different time periods. Now, the other thing to bear in mind is that pubs are buildings in their own right, so they will turn up in records of that you might use to trace the history of any building. Obviously, as properties, they might come up for sale, so they might turn up within the records of auctioneers or solicitors. DDHH is a collection which relates to land agents and surveyors that was based in Lancaster, and there's a huge run of hundreds of sales particulars within the collection, advertising properties that have come up to be sold by auction. So this example shows the White Horse pub in Lancaster, which is still an active pub. It's now the Stonewell Tap. And the particulars give a lot more information than this, but they include a brief description of the property. So we've got the fully licensed public house and spirit vaults known as the White Horse, situated on the north side of Lower Church Street and numbered 8. And they also give a plan which shows its location and shows the extent of the property that's actually being sold. Something else that's worth flagging up, really just as a tip that's kind of unknown at the minute. So DDGN are the records of Jabez Jones and Son, who are another auctioneers who were based in Preston. So right now, this collection is uncatalogued. So there isn't information in our catalogue to tell you what you might find within it. But thanks to Sue Latimer, who used to work at the Harris Museum, who's been going through these boxes, she gave me the tip when she heard I was doing this talk that there's lots of information in there about pubs. A lot of their early business seems to have involved selling local pubs. So there are boxes and boxes of books which have valuations of pub buildings within them. So for now, they're a bit of a mystery, but she is in the process of creating a list for us. Hopefully that will be opened up eventually. So this image here is from a really big valuation of the old Bull Hotel, as it was then, which is again now the Bull and Royal in Preston. And it goes through every single room in the pub. It lists every item of furniture, wine and beer glasses, goods. You can see in the valuation, it's a huge property. There are at least 35 bedrooms. There's servants' rooms. There's the bar. There's spirit and wine cellars, kitchens, toilets, a billiard room, coffee room, the laundry, the Derby room, and the Masonic room, which is where Masonic meetings were held in Preston before the Masonic Hall opened up in Saul Street. None of it's that easy to read. A lot of it's been scrawled in pencil, so it's quite faint and quite hard to read. But even just looking at this, looking at the example of the stable, the fact that we know that the bay horse at the pub at that time was 10 years old and was called Paul is something you just wouldn't expect to find anywhere else. Now, the fact that meetings were being held at the hotel is a good reminder that pubs turn up in unexpected places because they have been at the centre of a community. This painting I found an art, it's part of the Harris Museum's collections. It's called the Preston By-Election of 1862. And it shows the Bull and Royal Hotel on the right-hand side. The winner of the election, Sir Thomas Hesketh, stood up in its balcony. So pubs really are at the centre of political activities, of elections. You might find them mentioned in minute books for local organisations. They might be the setting for courts, coroner's inquests, the location of auctions. You very often see them mentioned on sales particulars. So the name of a pub will turn up in lots of different places in records that actually have nothing to do with pubs and licensing. But because of this, it means that pubs are very often recorded in newspapers. Now, if you have a Lancashire Library card, you can actually access the British Library digitised collection of newspapers online through the digital library. So I had a quick look on that and just did a search for the Black Horse Inn in Kirkham, just to see what came up. Now I got a whole raft of results. So these are just a few examples of the kind of thing you might find. Stupidly, I forgot to make a note of the dates of these, but they were generally sort of 1840s to 1850s. So here we've got the Blood Horse, so a thoroughbred called Solicitor, who's being toured around pubs throughout the county to act as a stud for the local mayors. So the horse owners have been told to bring their mares along to the pubs on the dates given. And we see here that on Thursdays, the Solicitor will appear at the Black Horse in Kirkham. This is rather depressingly headlined Beer and Hanging. And this is the tale of John Blacko, who has been charged with stealing 7 bottles of beer, having been found in the basement of the Black Horse, which at this time is the property of Mrs. Brown. He's been found in the cellar in a drunken state with 2 bottles of beer under his arm. 5 more have been found at his home. He was arrested, taken to the police station, and after arrest, he was found in a cell having tried to hang himself. Now, Mrs. Brown decided not to press charges, but he was released without caution. And from a modern viewpoint, without any psychiatric help either, which is a bit strange. Here again, we've got Mrs. Brown being mentioned, and she's been brought to trial at the Petty Sessions for breaking her licence agreement. So she's been found to be selling beer outside of the permitted licensing hours. So PC Smith had visited her house at 20 to 9 in the morning and found 3 men in the stable with the ostler, with a half-gallon jug of beer being served by him to the men. And she was fined 20 shillings in costs for this breach of her licence. In this last example, we can see that a Miss Brown is actually giving up the licence. So, we can maybe assume that Mrs. Brown might have died and now her daughter is actually selling the property. So the Black Horse has been put up for sale at an auction. It's described as the Black Horse Inn in Kirkham with barns, shippons, stables, brew house and yards, kitchen, bowling green. It contains about 1,975 square yards of land. And the report says that the lot was withdrawn because the bidding didn't meet the £2,000 reserve, but the property was later sold privately. Finally, I'd just like to touch on a couple of more general sources that might be worth a look. Pubs will often turn up on ordnance survey maps. Sometimes they're just marked as PH for public house or hotel. Sometimes, if you're lucky, the name is given. So in this example here, this is actually where I live. This building on the corner of the street is quite a big property. It's actually private flats now, but you can see when you look at it that it's obviously a pub. And we can see from the 1910 Ordnance Survey map here that it would have been called the Victoria Hotel. Obviously, building plans, we mentioned the licensing plans, but building plans may well turn up within general series of council building plans as well. The survival can be very patchy, so we've got lots of plans for some towns and very few for others, depending on what the councils have kept. We have listed some of our plan collections. Most of the examples that I managed to find searching the catalogue for pubs were actually for Preston. It's also worth having a look at census returns. If you go on Find My Past, which you can access free of charge in the archives and in library buildings, you can actually search by address. So you have to select the individual census. So in this case, I did the 1911 census, and then you can choose to either search by name of person or address, which is really worth knowing. So I did a search for West Road in Lancaster, and the Victoria Hotel was actually named as one of the properties on the street. But you look at this and you think, actually, was it operating as a hotel? Because all of the people named are relatives of the owner. So here in 1911, Isaac Robinson Jackson is the licensee. He gives his occupation as licensed victualler. His wife, Margaret, is listed as assisting with the business. And the two of their children are also working behind the bar, working in the pub. But certainly on this census night, there aren't any guests listed within the hotel. And one very last thing that I wanted to quickly mention is photographs. Also, we started with that wonderful photograph from Red Rose Collections. This book, if you're researching Preston history, is absolutely worth looking at. It's a small collection of Preston Borough licensing records. So there's a couple of licensing registers, but there's also this really unusual volume. This was compiled by the Detective Chief Inspector of Lancashire Constabulary in 1981. And it was a way to celebrate the 800th birthday of Preston County Borough. It includes a photograph of every pub that was standing in Preston at that time. It's got a really good index at the front, which gives the image number, the name of the pub, the name of the licensee at that time, and the date of the start of their tenancy. Now, most of them were 1970s, but I found at least a couple of examples going back to the 50s. So if you're interested in Preston pubs in that sort of era, it's definitely worth a quick look. And the pubs are actually shown in alphabetical order. Just these 4 images, you get a sense of the different types of pubs you find. So we've got the Old Black Bull, which is very traditional. It's kind of mock Tudor look. We've got the Bull and Royal, which is a traditional kind of coaching inn. The example on the left is the Oddfellows Arms, which was on Mount Street. That's now where Hartley's pub is. Which looks like very much that traditional beer house operating out of someone's dwelling house. The example on the right, I just think is absolutely hideous, but it's a prefab structure. It's the Carter's Arms, which was a Newhall Lane, And that was actually prefab that was put in place of an earlier, much more traditional household pub building. It's a bit odd that the police thought this was a way to celebrate the history of the town, but for us it's a fantastic record because lots of these pubs will have closed, and that's only going to get worse probably in the next year thanks to the pandemic. But it does again stress that pubs are really of interest to lots of people. So I think before you go out and do any research of your own, it's always worth having a look to see what's been done before, because lots of people have done research in this area. Sometimes pub owners themselves will put their history on their website. A couple of examples I found: the Sun Inn in Lancaster, which is one of the oldest pubs in the town, have got a fantastic history on the website. And also Plough, that's Plau, in Preston, I've got a really long detailed history on their website of the history of the site as a pub, which has just got loads of amazing information in it. There's a Pubs in Preston blog by Stephen Halliwell, and also his book that tells you pretty much anything you might want to know about pubs in Preston. And there's lots of books as well, so it's worth having a look at the library catalogue before you do your own research, just to see what's already known about the pubs that you want to research. One final thing I just wanted to show you, there was a project a couple of years ago looking at Skelmersdale, Newtown, and photographic collections relating to the town, and we stumbled across this and just loved the image, because obviously new towns, you can come in and design buildings exactly as you might want them to be and design ideally the optimum building, and this was offering guidance for a pub and how much space you might need in that pub to accommodate people, either seating or standing or a mix of the two. So here we've got 8 people seated and standing being squeezed into 24 square feet. And again, this is just harking back to this idea that this really was a world that didn't know the concept of social distancing, and just how much things have changed in the last year. And really, since I thought about covering this topic, is just enormous.